Let's go back to the launch of the PlayStation 2. When the platform was originally released, there was a lot of flack towards it because it was the most expensive game system on the market at launch. But at the same time, it was also selling like hotcakes because it doubled as one of the cheapest DVD players on the market. When an expensive new game system launches, people are going to want to have something to show for it. Despite having an incredibly amount of launch titles compared to most systems, not too many of them stood out to most people as a true system seller. I remember the only game that really stood out to me back then was Dynasty Warriors 2, just because of the sheer amount of soldiers on the battlefield, something that I'd never seen before. A lot of the other games felt like something that could have been done on literally every other system, and I think that sentiment was shared by a lot of people at the time. I once saw an official PlayStation 2 demonstration video boasting of the power of the PlayStation 2 using footage of the Dark Cloud QTE scenes, a game that never really looked all that great, and Operation Winback, a game that had been out for over a year on the Nintendo 64 already. Game magazines kept looking to developers releasing games in the future to truly show what the PlayStation 2 could do, jumping on every game to finally show us the true power of Sony. One of the developers that everyone really looked towards to finally show us what this new platform could do was Squaresoft. After having built up a reputation for creating visually stunning titles on the first PlayStation, it was expected that they would manage to do it again. So when Squaresoft announced their new big cinematic masterpiece coming to the PlayStation 2, it got a lot of coverage. This is a game that was featured on the cover of a lot of game magazines, getting constant coverage for every scrap of information. Their new title?
The Bouncer.
The first thing that we should talk about regarding the Bouncer is that this is during the era of Squaresoft while they were still working on their big Final Fantasy movie that hadn't come out yet. We knew they were making it, and a lot of people expected them to deliver, so it made sense at the time for them to make a game that looked like playing a movie. We wouldn't have known how utterly incapable of delivering a good cinematic product they were just yet. A year after The Bouncer came out, Squaresoft finally gave us Final Fantasy, The Spirits Within, and any idea of them being able to create a cinematic experience of worth died with it. Did I also mention that The Bouncer almost immediately faded into obscurity after release? No? Well, now I have. So the first thing you notice from The Bouncer, both from the opening cutscene and from the back of the DVD case, is that this game very desperately wants to be taken seriously as a movie. The back of the case outright even calls it an action movie. The second thing you notice is that our heroes, the so-called bouncers, don't really do much of that bouncing the title of the game would imply. They kind of just lounge near a nightclub in an oversized break room together. I guess it's a move to make the cast seem more sympathetic because bouncers are like extortionists of the nightlife, demanding honest partygoers to hand them a tip for not rendering any services to them before allowing them to enter. They're like trolls standing in front of a bridge, except they get an hourly wage on top of their shitty task. Thankfully, our heroes aren't anything like that. They work in shifts, so they don't have to spend their full time in the club demanding money from innocent people entering the nightclub, and can instead lounge around in luxury. The second thing you'll notice is the gameplay. Now, I have to be honest, my recording of the game, I emulated it on PC to get my footage. The game has a bunch of emulation problems resulting in frequent slowdown. I've played the game on the original hardware as well, and I can safely tell you that this does not magically make it a more enjoyable game to play. I'm mostly saying this so people understand why the gameplay slows down so much, because it doesn't in the original release. The gameplay just has a lot of problems in general. First off, the combat is a much worse version of Ergheiz. Ergheiz is a really bad fighting game Square made on the PlayStation 1 and then tried to sell it by putting a bunch of Final Fantasy VII characters into it. This plays a lot like it, but slower, even without the emulation problems you see in this video. There's a bunch of launchers and the basic one-button combos, but none of them really lead to anything. They feel like an excuse for the developers to show off the weird ragdoll effect the game has. I would have liked it if the enemies bounced a bit more from the ridiculous heights that they get from punching or kicking them into the air, so you could at least justify calling this game The Bouncer somewhere, but unfortunately we don't really get much to work with in this game. For every enemy you kill, you gain experience. They call it bouncer points. Bouncer points can be used to upgrade your health, attack, or buy new moves. Also, if any of your teammates kill an enemy, you don't get experience points. For whatever reason, they decided that in a game with 3 constant team members with individual stats and a need for experience points to increase them, only the player character gains any experience points, and the income is solely based on who gets the last hit. Before every battle, you can switch between party members, and if you do this, the problem only gets worse, as your upgraded characters are now controlled by the AI, making it more likely for them to get those last hits in, making you lose the total amount of experience points you could have gotten across the entire team, dragging everyone further behind. Because letting them fall behind is a safer choice than letting everyone fall behind. In the meantime, about halfway through the game, your teammates will have become entirely useless, even beyond their bad AI, because they have no health, defense, or damage, as they likely will not have had any experience income whatsoever. That said, on my own, having most of the last hits in the game, I still lacked the experience points to fully upgrade my character, unlocking pretty much none of the moves and only maxing out one single stat. Experience income is so low, and the required points for upgrades is just incredibly high. I thought it was a joke when I saw the save screen count how many times you've beaten this game, but apparently the idea really was that you'd rewatch this movie countless times to fully upgrade your full team. The transition to the stat upgrading screen is jarring as well, as the game just cuts towards it awkwardly after you defeat the last enemy, with no transition or music of any kind. It looks like something I would have edited. In fact, the entire gameplay loop is handled this awkwardly, as you go from cutscene to character select screen, to fight scene, to experience screen, to the next cutscene on repeat for most of the game. It's handled very badly, and at no point does it ever flow nicely. The camera dates back to the time when a lot of game developers outside of Nintendo hardware hadn't heard of Mario 64 yet and stared blankly at the second analog stick, not realizing what they could possibly use such a weird thing for. If you want to move the camera, you have to trap it into a corner or against a wall and run around it to reposition it. A lot of times, the default position for the camera that the game uses makes it face the wrong way, so you can't see what you're running towards. There's a weird section in the game where you run through an empty office building, and it actually becomes hard to navigate because the camera isn't cooperating during this at all, even though you don't really have a choice where to go. There's only really one direction you can go. With all of these weird gameplay problems at every level, you'd hope the story is at least fine, right? Since the Bouncer is trying to sell itself as an action movie. It should at the very least be strong from that perspective, right? Well, no. You know that old viral video of the 3-year-old girl explaining Star Wars Episode 4?
Kenobi sometimes move things around, sometimes he disappears.
That's how this story is told. There's a giant space microwave that can power cities if used, and people wonder if this might cause radiation problems if turned on, but this isn't important right now. A girl in a raincoat comes to the club Sion is a bouncer at and gets kidnapped. She's kidnapped by ninjas, and he storms out to save her. With no indication of where to go, he keeps running in the right direction with his friends because there's more evil ninjas everywhere he goes for some reason. He stumbles his way onto a train that just happens to be headed where he needs to go. The train gets shut up, but Sion and his friends just manage to jump out right before it crashes into a wall and explodes. Then they sneak their way into a giant mansion where the bad guy is talking about his plan with his master, who he then kills. This is also apparently Sion's master, so now Sion wants revenge. After getting bodied and thrown in jail, Sion finds a computer that spoils the rest of the story, but thankfully even after reading it, looking at the images and responding to it audibly,
Carudia?
he's still surprised when these plot points are finally brought up in the rest of the game.
わかるわけないわよね。
And at some point you go into a space station that can microwave the planet because we needed something for dramatic tension, and we just threw that in. If you think I glanced over anything, this is generally the pace the story moves at, with gameplay in between every story beat. The gameplay moments typically last about a minute per piece. The most bizarre and dumbest things keep happening, and everyone just accepts it as normal immediately before moving on to the next absolutely insane plot point. There isn't much going on with the story, although it is impressive how much ground it manages to cover with the runtime of about an hour and a half. Though I guess this is what happens when you put most of the story into flashbacks that just happen for no reason. So is there anything actually good about the Bouncer? Looking around for info, I did find a couple of people who really liked the game, but unsurprisingly, they also just happened to be on NeoGAF. I did like the weird story loading screens that made no sense in relation to the rest of the game. They kind of reminded me of the nonsensical text at the start of Final Fantasy VIII's opening cinematic. And the presentation behind them was pretty neat. Don't play the Bouncer. It's not a very good game. It's not even worth the hour of your life needed to go through it. I don't think I've ever come across a game I would just not recommend to this extreme, but here we are. It's a very bad game. Also, yeah, I know, someone else recently made a video on the Bouncer. It came out just as I was working on my video, and I decided to still go through with it because I ended up canceling another video for a similar reason too recently. I'll likely still do my other video soon, but I wanted to give it some time so it doesn't look like I'm copying all of my video ideas from others. Anyway, this was AboveUp. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will, see ya.